So friends and colleagues, I can't tell you after more than a year of work how gratifying it is to see you all in this auditorium. I thank you for coming and joining us from all parts of the world, more than 130 countries represented at our conference this year. We've got a fantastic program for you throughout the week, but in particular tonight, our opening ceremonies include a welcome from two of Canada's foremost leaders in education, the Minister of Education of the province of Ontario, the Honourable Liz Sandals, and also our new president of the University of Toronto, Professor Merrick Gertler, and they'll be joining us in a few minutes. I just wanted to start by saying a huge shout out and thanks to so many of you who have volunteered to put together a program of the highest quality and integrity for this year's conference. Our volunteers, from our special interest groups to our New Scholars Committee and to many, many others, has managed to keep this society, as it grows to a membership of over 2,000, an intimate, generous, and creative place where young and senior scholars alike enjoy comparing the work that they do to solve educational problems and enhance educational opportunities around the world. I also want to thank the team at OISE. I can't tell you how hard the students, the faculty, and others have worked to make this conference a success, all under the leadership of our program chair, Dr. Caroline Mannion. I'm going to ask Carly to stand up here today, who has personally responded to thousands of emails. And I also want to recognize the Dean of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. She has supported us in all our efforts and allowed us to make this conference what it is. Julia, I wonder if you'd just stand up and take a little bow, because she really is, she is responsible for so much of this event. Thank you, Julia. Yes. I'm going to turn the mic now over to the 16th president of the University of Toronto. And it has been really such an honor over the last 12 years to be a faculty member at this university, Canada's foremost university, most research-intensive university in one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world. Professor Gertler's work is all about cities. He is an urban theorist, internationally renowned for his work on innovation and creativity and culture and how these things feed economic development in cities. I won't say any more, but I know that he is going to talk to us a little bit about education for all. So thank you, President Gertler.
Thank you so much, Karen, for that warm introduction. Let me also offer my best wishes as you prepare to take on the presidency of the Comparative and International Education Society. Also like to extend special greetings to my fellow speakers this evening, the Honourable Liz Sandals, our Minister of Education here in Ontario, and I will say a little bit more about Liz in a minute, and also Professor Gilbert Valverde, who is President of the CIES, and you will hear from him soon as well. Let me also acknowledge my colleague and friend, our wonderful Dean of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. She just waved at you a few minutes ago, Professor Julia O'Sullivan. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Toronto. We have laid on a warm day and enjoy it while you can, because it may not last. But we are absolutely delighted that you have joined us here. And over the next few days, the world's leading authorities on education will address a theme of tremendous importance: revisioning education for all. It's a marvelous opportunity for all of us to share our experience and expertise and to move forward together in realizing this critically important goal. I understand that this is the largest ever meeting of CIES, with delegates, as you heard, from around the world, and representatives of international organizations, foundations, NGOs, ministries of education, and of course, the world's leading faculties of education. And I'm pleased to note that many of these organizations are key partners with OISE and with U of T. And ladies and gentlemen, to provide some context from my perspective, I would like to offer you a few highlights of U of T's commitment to education for all. The ethos of the University of Toronto may be understood in really two words: excellence and accessibility. U of T has taken its place as one of the world's great public universities, indeed one of the great universities of the world, full stop. At the same time, though, we are also a large, accessible, urban university, one that is deeply embedded in the economic and social fabric of the Greater Toronto Area. U of T can be properly thought of as a portal of opportunity for thousands of undergraduates, 1 in 5 of whom is the first in their family to attend university. And we are strongly committed to ensuring that all qualified students can enter and remain at U of T to complete their studies regardless of their personal financial means. In fact, the university's governing council endorsed this policy formally by passing it as a policy of the university in 1998. It has since been adopted by our sister institutions in the province and is indeed now guiding the Ontario government's student access guarantee. But the ethos of accessibility extends much farther back in our history. Indeed, one of the most outstanding citizens of the University of Toronto community, the Honourable Bill Davis, is an alumnus of the university and a very distinguished former Premier of the province of Ontario. As Minister of Education in the 1960s, he established Ontario's system of community colleges, itself a remarkably progressive innovation from which we continue to benefit in so many ways today. And he launched what is now our world-renowned Faculty of Education, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Since then, OISE itself has made tremendous contributions in education research, training, and policy, and not least in the promotion of access to education. Among other things, it has had a profound influence on early childhood education policy in Ontario and beyond. And it is also home of U of T's newly established Fraser Mustard Institute for Human Development. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are proud of our commitment to accessibility. But I believe you will agree that our vision of accessibility must not be limited to the policies of one university or even one country. The principles of social justice also require a global focus, and so international collaboration is absolutely crucial in the advancement of education for all, and I think it is so beautifully demonstrated by the attendance at this conference. As you know, universal primary education is one of the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, and access to education figures prominently in another MDG to promote gender equality and to empower women. Education is fundamental to individual and social well-being and progress, and I know I'm speaking to the converted here when I say these things. But as the UN has correctly perceived, it is truly a global project. We see it in every aspect of our own experience here at U of T. 43% of U of T's co-authored research papers involve collaboration with researchers outside of Canada, 43%. And over the past few years, our international faculty hiring has accounted for roughly 1/2 of all of our academic hiring. So we are a very internationalized faculty. We also have a very internationalized student body. Fully 20% of our undergraduate intake this year was comprised of international students. It's a very big number, in case you were unaware. Of course, this is also set within a local context in which something like 50%, that's 50% of the population of the Toronto region were born outside of Canada. There's no other metropolitan region in the world that approaches that level of diversity. And so this wonderful diversity is a huge source of strength for the University of Toronto, and it's crucial in helping us achieve our goals of helping prepare global citizens and to meet global challenges. And it also impresses on us how important it is that we listen and learn and contribute as part of a truly global conversation. As U of T professor Marshall McLuhan famously said, the modern world is indeed an interdependent global village. And that's why a gathering such as this one is so important for all of us, and why we are so grateful and so excited that you are all here. In closing, I think when we look at the scale and the complexity of the challenges we face, it is understandable that we may at times feel a bit overwhelmed. But when we look around us, we are inspired. There is such enormous brain power in this room and a world of goodwill too, and that bodes extremely well for this conference and for the advancement of our common goals in revisioning education for all. So on behalf of the University of Toronto, I wish you well in your deliberations and discussions over the next few days. Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed my great honor to introduce our next speaker, the Honourable Liz Sandals. Minister Sandals represents the electoral district of Guelph. First elected to the Ontario legislature in 2003, she was appointed Minister of Education after serving as the parliamentary assistant to ministers in a number of leading portfolios. She led the government's Safe Schools Action Team and has served on important committees of the legislature and the Treasury Board and Management Board of Cabinet. Liz Sandals first became involved in politics through her involvement in education issues. She was elected to her local public school board in 1988. Re-elected 4 times, she served as chair of the board and was elected as president of the Ontario Public School Boards Association from 1998 to 2002. And in recognition of her work as president of the School Boards Association, she was selected as the first recipient of the Outstanding Contribution to Education Award by the Ontario Principals Council. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Honourable Liz Sandals.
Thank you so much, Merrick. And I too am delighted to be here. And I think Merrick represents post-secondary education in Ontario here tonight. I'm the other end of the spectrum. My Ministry of Education includes childcare and elementary and secondary education in Ontario. So you've got the full spectrum here tonight. But I would really like to extend a big thank you to OISE and the University of Toronto for hosting this event. And I'd also like to welcome all of you, all the international delegates, all our Canadian delegates who have come from all across the globe to join us here at this prestigious conference. As Ontario's Minister of Education, I'm pleased to acknowledge representatives from ministries of education from Afghanistan, Brazil, Chile, the Gambia, Georgia, Jordan, Kenya, Lebanon, Malawi, Mexico, Samoa, Saudi Arabia, Senegal, Southern Sudan, Thailand, and Zambia, just to name a few. We're also honored to have with us here in Ontario today a wide number of international delegates from major non-government organizations, foundations, institutions, and philanthropic organizations. For example, UNESCO, the OECD, UNICEF, and the Aga Khan Foundation. So on behalf of the province of Ontario, even if I didn't mention you, welcome. Because everyone in this room plays a role in supporting student success. I'm proud that this year's conference is being hosted in Ontario, where our publicly funded education system is considered one of the best in the world, and we're very proud of it. Over the last decade, we've worked very hard to build partnerships with parents, teachers, educators, and students to help our young people achieve success. These united efforts have garnered our province a reputation for innovation and excellence. We've also contributed to national and international bodies of knowledge in concert with institutions like U of T and OISE and other universities and faculties of education around the province. But we've contributed to the international body of knowledge about effective teaching and learning, school improvement, school leadership, system change, and innovation. And our governments invested in publicly funded education have delivered higher graduation rates and better assessment results. Much of our success is based on the talent, dedication, and hard work of those in our education community and the partnerships that we've built across the province. We want every child in Ontario to gain the knowledge, skills, and confidence that will allow them to be successful and engaged citizens of the future. And we're seeing great results. 10 years ago, 1/3 of all students were not graduating from high school. Today, 83% of high school students are graduating in Ontario. And part of that is due to the fact that we have thought very deliberately about education for all and work to ensure that students have opportunities in skill-based streams as well as the more traditional academic stream, so that we're reaching out to the needs of all our students. Similarly, a decade ago, only half of all students in grade 3 and 6 were achieving our high provincial standard in literacy and numeracy, which is an A or a B. Today, 71% of students are meeting or exceeding that standard. And we've also made significant investments in our youngest learners. Our full-day kindergarten program for 4- and 5-year-olds is the most significant investment in our education system in a generation. Starting this September, it will be available to all 4- and 5-year-olds all across the province. The program offers a full day of play-based learning, and the early research on the program, including research conducted by OISE, is already indicating that students are better prepared when they start grade 1. All of these efforts have increased public confidence in our education system. However, we know there's room for improvement. So, for example, something that I think, is occupying educators all over the world is the area of mathematics. And we know that we too have room to improve in the area of how do we most effectively teach mathematics. And I know from conversation with other jurisdictions that that's something that occupies many of you. I'm gonna, whoops. Sorry, I've succumbed to the Ministry of Education cold. In Ontario, we have been reviewing our math curriculum on an ongoing basis to ensure that it remains relevant and up to date, because research has been fundamental in helping us set high standards for ourselves. It helps to ensure that our curriculum is comprehensive and that it is developmentally appropriate. And we're committed to developing policies, programs that are evidence-based. And that's where many of you play such an important role, is producing the evidence about what really works. In math, it's not just a matter of being able to memorize the answer to a question. We also want to make sure that our students actually understand the basic concepts and can move on to what people in the community tell us they want from graduates, which is the ability to solve problems and to think critically about the problems that face them as they move on into the world. This isn't just the education community that informs this perspective, it's also the business community and their leadership. They're seeking out employees who have critical thinking and problem-solving skills that our students can gain through a balanced approach to math and an evidence-based approach to many other subjects. So as we exchange ideas and look at our approach to education, I'm really excited to see your approach to this conference, revisioning education for all, because that's actually what we've been doing here in Ontario, is looking at how do we move forward. If we want our students to excel, we cannot be content with the progress we've already made. We know that we need to look forward at what can we do better and what is our renewed vision for education. As we move through the process of consulting with people all over the province, we certainly heard that people wanted us to make sure that we were thinking about the implications of new technology on education. What are the implications of teaching and educating students in a globalized economy and in a province where we've had significant demographic changes? Because we want our children to become fully engaged citizens, ready and able to contribute to their families, communities, and province, we've consulted with a wide range of stakeholders, not just conventional education stakeholders, but also the broader community. There was a greater emphasis on higher order skills like critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and entrepreneurship. We heard over and over again, not just from business leaders, but from students, that they wanted to learn more about entrepreneurship. And I think that's maybe because in today's world economy, students actually, even high school students, understand that it's no longer a world where you get a job for life and that's what you're going to do for the rest of your life. Even our high school students are understanding that they're going to have to be flexible and innovative and entrepreneurial in order for them to succeed in a world that's very different from the world in which many of us grew up. This input has helped us envision ways to take our education system from great to excellent. And I'm sure that that's exactly what you're going to talk about at this conference amongst yourselves, is how do we make sure that throughout the world, as we look at supporting our young people, how do we all move education from great to excellent? Thank you.
Well, again, friends and colleagues, I get to introduce our president, who has served so diligently over the last several years, our society. And some of you who know the society well, may know that we run our presidents through a gauntlet. The first year, we make them organize the conference, and the second year, we make them give a keynote to the whole crowd. And at the end of that, we say thank you. So, tonight, President Gilbert Valverde will be presenting to us, and his talk is entitled Education Quality, Global Politics, Comparative Inquiry, and Opportunities to Learn. Professor Valverde is a professor in the Department of Educational Policy and Leadership at the University of Albany. He is a well-known and internationally recognized expert on applied research in the broad area of standardized testing, assessment, and curriculum policy. And his work has included cross-national research on global trends in mathematics and science education policy, especially policies regarding testing standards and opportunities to learn mathematics and the sciences in elementary and secondary school. He is the director and principal investigator of the Educational Evaluation Research Consortium, and which has conducted a series of longitudinal studies of educational opportunities in math and reading comprehension from 4th to 7th grade in the Dominican Republic. He has been a member of the Working Group on Standards and Evaluation of the PREAL program, the program to promote educational reform in Latin America, and he has served as an advisor to many international organizations, including NASA, the OECD, the World Bank, the UNDP, and the Inter-American Development Bank, among others. Professor Valverde has brought to our society a great deal of organizational and management wisdom. He has moved us from being an entirely volunteer-based society to being a society that has some professional management. He's inspiring to work with, and I know he's going to be inspiring to hear tonight. Please join me in welcoming our very own president, Professor Gilbert Valverde.
Thank you. First, I think we need to once again recognize Karen Mundy, Carly Mannion, and the University of Toronto for being such formidably gracious hosts and auguring such a wonderful Congress for this week, and for managing just a small squall in the middle of the week so that we recognize where we are, and yet none of our travel plans are adversely affected. So thank you very much, Karen, Carly, and the University of Toronto. I would hazard to guess that most presidents of CIES don't know what they're getting into. We have some fears and some suspicions, and certainly the conference is one of the greatest fears that arises, but then immediately after the Congress is this terrible responsibility of the presidential address. So in my terror, given this responsibility, I thought, well, the obvious thing to do is to think about good past presidents and their addresses. And my own professional trajectory starts at the Comparative Education Center at the University of Chicago, and I'm now a faculty member at the University at Albany. So naturally, that trajectory and those associations lead me to Phil Foster. When I arrived at the University at Albany, Phil Foster was emeritus, and for him, as for the only other emeritus that I'm friends with, the word emeritus really does mean merit. He was one of the most gentlemanly and gracious examples of the truly superb scholar, warm, humorous human being, and he was very, very gracious in extending his friendship to me. Every month when he would have a haircut near University at Albany, he would visit me in my office and make sure that I was doing well. And that meant actually asking me very tough questions about the research that I was doing. So I looked to Phil for some clues about how to go about today's business, because he had always proven a good example in the past. Phil, in his presidential address in 1971 in San Diego, addressed a challenge at that time for the field of comparative and international education, which was the rise and the prominence of the deschooling movement, which were called the radical critics of formal schooling, most notably perhaps represented by Ivan Illich in the deschooling movement. As Phil cast a skeptic's eye on the deschooling movement, I would like to direct my skeptic's eye at another movement that has some similarities, I will argue, and it's a movement that I would call the movement of global radical advocacy of education, where the radical critics flew the flag of deschooling. There has arisen an international regime of tests, monitors, and other interested parties that fly the flag of educational quality. I would like to posit that this flag and this regime pose some interesting challenges analytically, theoretically, and scientifically to the field. As Phil was very thorough in his skepticism regarding the deschooling movement, I will also attempt to be thorough in my own way and suggest not only the challenges that global radical advocacy pose for the field, but also cast my eye on both the proponents and the detractors of these forces of advocacy, and suggest areas where there's still a great deal of work to be done. So we begin with that quote from Phil Foster, and I would like to talk first about the lofty aims of the forces of global radical educational advocacy. I'm still not going to use an acronym, but I'll try. We've witnessed in the last few decades a pivot that began in the 1990s worldwide between policies worldwide that were primarily oriented to ensuring that children had desks and roofs in schools, and the possibility of monitoring the success of policies by counting things, by counting schools, counting desks, counting textbooks, counting children in schools. In the 1990s, as many have observed, there was a global pivot toward this idea of quality, that somehow in addition to ensuring that young people have roofs and desks, we needed to ensure that they learned. Learning is a policy goal that presents formidable measurement challenges that counting children, desks, and schools do not present. I believe that there's a good sign that quality is triumphant. It is absolutely, even for those countries that will find it difficult to meet the 2015 goal of guaranteeing universal primary education, there is still an enormous focus, even in those countries, on the idea of quality. And one aspect of quality that is highlighted in all of these discussions of quality is the quality of educational outcomes. There is perhaps some controversy, some discussion about what precisely those outcomes are, but there is clearly a direct emphasis on quality of outcomes. Every country, whether or not they've met, whether or not they can declare victory regarding the old goal of guaranteeing desks and roofs, are also focusing on quality. There has arisen many agents and many agencies that are interested in furthering this idea of quality and that promote internationally derived definitions of educational quality. Some of those internationally derived definitions of educational quality are promoted by agencies involved in identifying indicators of quality themselves, and others are promoted by other agencies, other organizations that have taken ideas about operational definitions of quality and attempted to promote them. And I will devote most of my talk today to talking about how this might work and where there are opportunities for the field to learn. Quality of outcome focused policies, I think worldwide, have been regarded now as at least one of the primary causal factors leading to a successful educational system. Whether it's standards, whether it's the Brazilian policy of increasing their score on PISA over a period of time, whether it is any other number of quality goals, including the quality goals of education for all or of the Millennium Development Goals, we live in an era of goal-driven concern for quality. So who are these global advocates? Obviously, and of course when Karen read my biography, thank you, it sounds much better from you than as I remember it, you might think, well, he's thinking of the large-scale cross-national tests. Yes, I am. But I would like to argue that in addition to the large-scale cross-national tests, there are other regimes very much interested in identifying, collecting, and promoting standards of quality. They might not call them standards, but that's what they are. They are criteria of quality that are held up as a measuring stick against which countries are intended to benchmark themselves. So I would include here the large international agreements such as Education for All and the Millennium Development Goals that set goals and that have within their structure mechanism for monitoring progress toward those goals. In addition to, let's say, these two primary agents of goal-driven educational policy, we have the many global agencies, foundations, corporate interests, etc., that promote one or other version of these quality goals. Setting targets, collecting, comparing, and disseminating indicators to monitor their accomplishment are things that both the monitoring groups and the international tests do. They don't often necessarily agree with each other. There is competition within these forces of advocacy, which I would like to contend are important areas for us to do further work. Certainly if you pick up, for example, the 2005 EFEA quality report, one of the charming aspects of this is with tweezers, they address the issue of the cross-national tests with a certain sort of charming contemptuousness. And the report, I counted on one occasion 5 or 6 mentions of how tests are imperfect proxies. That is not said about things that apparently are less imperfect, like literacy rates, the gender-specific index, or enrollment rates, which apparently don't have the validity and reliability problems that large-scale international tests do. What I submit is that we are in an era in which there is an architecture of agents that are involved in the formulation, monitoring, and promotion of sets of quality of outcomes, policy targets on the global scene. They don't agree with each other, but they agree in one key respect, that goal-driven policies are one sure road to educational improvement. They may disagree on the goals, but that is their area of agreement. And I call these regimes because I believe that there's good evidence that they are regimes in the same way that the entire international political economy of regimes exists. They are similar to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, similar to the North American Free Trade Agreement, and you'll excuse me as a half Costa Rican that I mentioned the Central American Free Trade Agreement as well. In all those cases, be it the GATT, be it EFA, be it PISA and the promotion of PISA goals as indicators of quality, they are regimes in the sense that, like the GATT and NAFTA, they define educational quality, they organize a set of rules, they promote certain beliefs about causation, how quality happens, expectations and norms, and they encourage their acceptance by groups of nations. In this regard, I think it is useful to think of them as another regime within the international political economy of regimes. Now, at this conference this week, there are many practitioners and many scholars that are involved in criticizing or advocating various agencies or agents of these regimes. We've done a great deal of work, in my estimation, in the field on the success of international tests and agreements, as well as their monitors. And in my view, the preponderance of that work has emphasized the power and authority of the international regimes themselves. So we seem to be in agreement largely that they are triumphant, that they are dominating debates on educational quality. But do these accounts that seem to focus primarily on the success of international regimes fully account for the demand for international regimes that is out there? Can we be fully satisfied with accounts of the triumph of these regimes that seem to discount, by omission or direct commission, the possible agency of countries and their educational systems, especially the agency of poor or low-achieving countries and systems? Obviously, I think not, and I'd like to explain why that might be the case. In my view, we are in a very rich time confronting a very rich set of new research problems and new problems of practice. We are not witnessing an era of simple success of agendas imposed from above and afar. We are also witnessing the rise of a completely new set of networks of intergovernmental agencies, public and private non-governmental agencies, partnerships, international and domestic, and even corporate interests, as well as many domestic agents with very different agendas that yet seem to be adding up to the continued success of global education advocacy. Now, I'd like to suggest that mention two examples that I think might be helpful in illustrating what I mean. So I'd like to consider two countries, Chile and Argentina, neighbors, both competitors in PISA's Cognitive Olympics, and both competitors in PISA's Cognitive Olympics that arrive at their participation and justify their participation through very different interplays of domestic and international agendas. I actually arrived for the first time in Chile, invited by the Concertación government and the World Bank to speak with the reformers at a time in which they were avidly implementing all of the ideas that they had been carefully harboring during their long period of the Pinochet dictatorship. Avid to make real changes in educational policy, they turned to many global agents. It may be very difficult to think of the Chile of 1997, but at that time, Chileans were sure that they lived very far from the rest of the world. One of the most interesting aspects of the change in Chile from the 1990s to today is the extent to which Chile has incorporated into the world system after years of feeling truly isolated. During the negotiation of a middle grades loan of the World Bank, the Mese Media, which was a big middle grade loan of the World Bank, there was discussion about whether or not Chile would participate in the Third International Mathematics and Science Study, which was what TIMSS meant in that era. Now it's the trends. It may surprise you to know that it was an inconvenience for TIMSS, for a country such as Chile, to aspire to participate in the test. It was by no means a TIMSS priority, and it caused some difficulties. First, because TIMSS was in fact the first time the IEA did a mathematics and science test simultaneously. And why would that be? The succession of tests in the IEA called for a new TIMSS with one S, Third International Mathematics Studies. But in the United States, we had just passed in 1994 the Goals 2000 Educate America's Act, which was that act that required by law that the United States become first in the world in mathematics and science by the year 2000. You remember that? Now, of course, there was a typographic error, and what was meant was that in 2,000 years, the United States would become mathematics and science. The developing world was not a priority. The IEA promoted a simultaneous test in order to get National Science Foundation funding because the NSF was interested in an instrument that would monitor that prime example of goal-driven educational policy. In fact, the National Science Foundation had thrown out the possible participation of one developing country, the Dominican Republic, in the research and development effort that went into the TIMSS. They were not interested. Two countries mattered in US policy, Japan and Germany. And all of the efforts was to make sure that Japan and Germany would participate, and it was not a priority to have participation of developing countries. Japan was not particularly interested in participating in yet another international comparison, and I witnessed from afar the tremendous amount of work that many actors had to invest in persuading the Japanese Ministry of Education to participate, particularly in the second round of TIMSS, when they were tired of being at the top of the list. All right? This was a tiredness that, as Associate Director of the U.S. National Research Center, I would have liked to have had that type of weariness of being at the top of the pack. At the same time, UNESCO was very interested in getting into the testing game. UNESCO's regional office for Latin America and the Caribbean is in Santiago, Chile, and they were promoting their own test, the CIES, the Laboratory for Evaluation of the Quality of Education. And they viewed the potential of Chilean participation in TIMSS with great hostility. This was very unwelcome. I was in the middle of this because at the time, with one important exception, I was the only Spanish speaker at that time in the TIMS network. So I was the one mediating between all of these various forces. I left with a great deal of respect for the United Nations and its mediation of things that really matter, because all I was trying to do was let a test happen and try to assuage the reactions of various local actors. UNESCO was hostile to TIMS and remained hostile to TIMS participation and PISA participation until very recently. But at the same time, actors in Chile were avidly looking for instruments to measure quality of education because they felt, and rightly so, given an evaluation of the instruments they had at the time, that they did not have good information on the outcomes of education in their countries. And their wariness about the Latin American test was that it was likely to have the same types of weaknesses that the many regional tests had at the time. So yes, the World Bank was promoting the idea of participation in TIMS, but there was an avid demand for better data on quality on the part of many Chilean educational policy actors. When we come to the most recently, I have been working on a new piece of research in which I'm interested in understanding why Latin American countries entered international testing regimes, what the purposes were, and what the history has been about whether or not these goals have been achieved or whether there looks like there has been progress toward these goals. Chile today is a completely different country in the world of testing. Chile now exports testing expertise to the entire region. It has one of the largest and most capable units in measurement at the Católica, the Universidad Católica de Chile, which is MIDE, which means measurement, one of the most preeminent groups of psychometricians, statisticians, and others that provide services across the region. It's begun a new teacher evaluation that began as a voluntary evaluation. It does not include in the teacher evaluation an assessment of student progress, but it includes portfolio assessments and many other things. And at the same time, building on the partnerships that is developed through TIMS and PISA, it has worked with the Australian Council of Educational Research in the development of standards for the Chilean educational system, which were called originally Mapas de Progreso. With the disappearance of the concertación from the government for a little while, and now resumed under the returning President Bachelet, they were called Mapas de Progreso, and for a period they were called openly standards. Standards in Latin American Spanish is an anathema. It has associations with the business world that make it very difficult to promote the world in goals. But you look at a Mapa de Progreso or any of the other instruments that, in the region, they are what we would understand to be standards in the United States, Canada, and the UK. They participate in every international assessment they are eligible to participate. PISA, all of the IES studies. They now sit on the technical committees of many of these studies and provide expertise and input to things like sampling, testing, etc. They still show low achievement on PISA and TIMS. There may be some indication they're improving, although Richard Wolff and myself have grave doubts about the quality of the data on improvement. We believe that there are problems with the calibration of these tests for low-achieving countries that make it more likely that the rankings in any given year are probably valid, reliable, but the inferences about progress are highly questionable. Because Chile is still at the low end of the distribution in both PISA and TIMS, every time a report is published, it comes at a great deal of cost for the government. There is a great deal of hand-wringing. Chile is a country that perceives itself to have spent enormous sums of money in increasing the quality of education and looks at their even questionable progress in TIMS and PISA as being insufficient given their aspirations. The country I would like to compare Chile to is Argentina. By the way, I met our past president at an NSF meeting discussing TIMS when you were at the, you were in a position at NSF. You were an NSF fellow at the time. You were at Catholic University. So I met my immediate predecessor during those years of the U.S. high level of policy interest in the TIMS as the monitor of the achievement of the Goals 2000 Educate America Act. In Argentina is a different story. Right next door, across the Andes are a big divider, but it's a useful comparison, I think. Here, it's also a bit of personal history. In 1993, there was a meeting of Latin American countries, mostly of mathematics educators, that was, in fact, primarily financed by the government of Canada. CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, OISE, and the University of British Columbia organized this meeting of many Latin American countries in Miami, and the host was Richard Wolff, who has done me the honor of coming to listen to my nonsense this afternoon. At that meeting, the idea was to organize the fairly slim resources of Latin American countries and see whether or not they could marshal what would be required to participate in the Third International Mathematics and Science Study. I did two things. I provided both substantive input to the meeting, but I also was haunted by the fact that I was the only bilingual person, so I did 3 simultaneous days of simultaneous translation without any relief. And Richard paid me in the biggest bottle of Scotch whiskey that I've ever seen in my life. But he was concerned for my health, so he helped me drink most of it. I receive a fax as I'm sitting there from the government of Argentina, from the Federal Ministry of Education. The fax, yes, this was last millennium, so it was a fax. No one was sending emails at that time, especially from ministries, because ministries were very wary of emails because they could not control that form of communication. Now it's a different story. I received the fax. They've given up. They'd still like to control it. I received the fax, and the fax was very brief. This gentleman, academic in mathematics education from Argentina, does not represent Argentina in any way or form, and Argentina has no intention of participating in TIMS. So whatever this gentleman is doing, he does on his own accord without any backing, and we will not be granting him access to Argentine schools to conduct the TIMS assessment. This was interesting during this period. This was a period in which there were a great deal of change taking place in Argentina. They were just coming out of their hyperinflationary period, and there's a great deal of international work taking place, particularly on the Argentine economy. So I'd argue that this was a period in which there was at least a degree of openness to the international system in Argentina that was fairly remarkable for the time, perhaps mostly imposed, but this was a bit outside of the model that seemed to be the case for the rest of the public sector in Argentina. Now we switch over to more recently. In this decade, Argentina participates in all PISA assessments. We have, again, a Peronista president. Now, most of you know Peronismo is not really a party, it's more like a movement, so maybe no consistency is to be expected. But in a period in which the Argentine government has made it an article of political importance to repudiate neoliberal global agencies, etc., they participate habitually in OECD's PISA. And the news isn't good for them. They rank lower than their rival Chile, who in addition, Chile is a member of the OECD, which is an additional thing. And my word, they rank lower than countries that they do not regard as their peers, such as Uruguay, and you'll excuse me. I had to mention Costa Rica before the end of the evening, so less than Costa Rica in this most recent round. And it comes at high political costs for the ministry. When the PISA reports come out, immediately Minister Silioni or someone else will come out and say that these tests are no good, that the Argentine educational system cannot be assessed by these tests. In this last report, so began again, but he apparently was persuaded to reverse himself and come out and say, there are signs that there are problems with the quality of education in Argentina, and we must address them. Quality of education in Argentina is a deeply felt problem. The Argentines, because of the work particularly of Domingo Sarmiento in the late 1800s, have regarded their educational system as being a standard of quality. When doing my interviews on participation in this test, one phrase I heard time and time again is one of the most curious phrases for a Costa Rican to hear, which is the phrase, "Nos volvimos Latinoamérica." We've turned into a Latin American country, which in Argentina is a catastrophe. And so it has high political costs, enormous political costs, but there's no more than the most cursory mentions of not continuing participation in the test, even during this period of repudiation against many international agencies and internationally promoted policies. Of course, particularly in the financial and economic sectors. In my interviews, however, it's clear that if there's not a high demand on the part of the ministry, as there was in the case of Chile, there's high demand for participation in TIMSS on the part of many civil society organizations. In visiting think tanks and visiting other academic institutions, etc., one thing I heard that the international literature had not prepared me to hear was the extent to which these actors distrusted any data coming from the federal government. There is no confidence in financial data or any other data, and they remain skeptical that the federal government is committed to quality testing and willing to publish any results that would indicate problems in educational quality. With these very superficial examples, I would like to suggest that we have sufficient evidence that makes it likely that a new program of comparative inquiry around these regimes of global quality advocacy is worth the attempt. I would suggest that in order to have sufficient explanatory leverage, they need to go beyond some of the critiques that essentially view national interest as primarily passive and derivative, simply victims of globalization, if you will. That there may be stories that we can tell if we leave aside some of the ideological elements of the debate and attempt to collect evidence regarding what really is happening. And I would suggest, in my two stories, I am certain there are those here that would be able to point out to me that the fact that there is demand for the international regimes in Argentina and Chile is a testimony to the effectiveness of the international agents from above and afar. I would suggest that that's a curious form of analytical hegemony, a willful blindness toward the possibility of agency on the part of weak nations and underachieving educational systems that is likely to diminish the quality of our work. It is an article of faith, it would appear, that weakness means a lack of agency. And I would suggest from my own evolving work that there is evidence of agency on the part of even the weakest nations participating in these various regimes. There is genuine demand for what global education quality advocates purport to be providing. They reduce the costs related to finding out what other countries are doing, and an interest in what other countries are doing is very high. They limit the uncertainties that participating nations face in evaluating each other's policies and their outcomes. And they offer the promise of taking advantage of the expertise of other nations, the high-ranked nations, the high-performing nations, in achieving educational quality. So I would like to suggest that the field would be in error if they left these problems to be simply part of pro- and anti-globalization ideological debates. We need answers to questions like, why do countries participate in international tests? Why do countries commit to internationally sanctioned targets? Why does Canada, CEDA, and USAID sign on to the EFA goals? What does Canada look for? What do the various countries that participate in Education for All look for in comparing with each other in these enormous tables of indicators in the statistical annexes of the monitoring reports? Who do countries want to compare themselves with? Does Argentina want to compare itself with Canada and the United States? Or is it with Chile? Does Canada or the United States care how they perform relative to Argentina and Chile? Who are they comparing themselves with? If, in fact, Argentina and Chile are comparing themselves with Finland's, Korea's, Singapore's, why would that be? What is the expectation derived from these comparisons? What do global and domestic actors seek? How does focusing on improvement in rank indicators promote or not good policy? So Phil tells us that we have no lack of lofty aims, and I suggest that the lofty aims of these global regimes are operationalized in their indicators or in their proficiency levels of their tests. But what about these principles of implementation that Phil reminds us we have a great deal of difficulty in reaching agreement on? Not reaching agreement on implementation might sound like a truism, but in fact, it's one of the keenly sought aspects driving demand for these international regimes. Countries want to find out how to have acceptable EFA gender-specific indexes, acceptable literacy rates, acceptable TIMSS proficiency levels, etc. And here I think is one of the most astonishing aspects of the triumph of quality on the international scene. One thing that seems to be overlooked, perhaps even willfully concealed, is that we almost have no evidence that the explicit pursuit of educational quality standards of any kind results in increased quality. I call this data-inspired speculation. It's essentially a bet. Global advocates of educational quality do not offer meaningful opportunities to learn from the expertise of other countries in achieving educational quality. They're not delivering on that promise that the demand seems to be explained by. And what do I mean by this? These ranked indicators are often used to promote specific educational policies, but these are hunches related to the ranked indicators themselves. They are rarely, if ever, tested empirical relationships. And in fact, most of the successful countries in the quality lottery did not succeed because they were pursuing EFA's goals, PISA's proficiency levels, or TIMSS performance levels. And we don't even know whose examples to follow. Who should we be following? Finland's small class sizes or Singapore's large class sizes? They perform similarly. There's been a great deal of interest in North America and Finland because I guess, and that is also a realm for additional empirical inquiry, there are certain examples we find more attractive than others. But neither TIMSS or PISA are designed to test whether or not there is a relationship between class size and educational quality. The design do not permit it. We have no better information on how to get kids to perform at PISA proficiency level 6 than we know how to make a country rise from literacy rate X to literacy rate G, or rise in the gender-specific index. How do we get there is the question that drives the demand for these policy regimes, and I believe that we have been at least overlooking and perhaps deliberately concealing the fact that we don't know. And the global advocates in particular have not been explicit about the extent to which we don't know. The problem with this is that we have some new evidence, particularly from the field that culture, that the idea of pursuing increases in standing in ranked indicators might be a very poor policy strategy. We know from economic and cultural research that ranked indicators, even when folks know or think they know what it takes to achieve a higher ranking, they rarely achieve it. And we may be focusing our investments improperly. Most of the countries that won the quality lottery had a wide portfolio of investments in education. They hedged their bets. The focus on defined and internationally sanctioned goals is certainly reducing and increasing the riskiness of betting. At least it's possible. The global advocates of educational quality, operational quality as goals, targets, ranked indicators, proficiency levels, and test scores, and they offer parameters to guide betting on quality. They suggest the idea of standards. They release test items. They release test frameworks. These are busily studied by countries, and they often offer recommended policy frameworks. For example, there's a large section denoting a policy framework in the 2005 FO report. There's an entire chapter devoted to policy frameworks. I submit that this is a hollow form of advocacy. The monitors and testers have almost never conducted empirical tests to verify the causal hypotheses that lie beneath these policy recommendations. Every policy is a causal hypothesis. And these ideas that are being advanced by these groups have not been tested. They may be good hunches. We don't know. The problem is that they're not advanced as hunches, in my view. They're advanced as expert opinion, and they have the strength of the international regime behind them. And the way they do this is curious. They typically look at winners and losers, and you and I both know that the losers don't really matter. What matters are the winners, so they pay attention on the winners, and they look at the winners and decide that whatever looks different about the winners is likely the explanation for their winning. If I had to do this over again, I considered briefly devoting an address to the world's need to have a better literature and stronger science on low-achieving countries, which have been entirely neglected because of the triumph of these tests and indicators. Whatever is different, we're told, or at least it's implied, causes excellence. Why do I call this data-inspired speculation? Because it's a curious form of betting. Indicators are collected, whether they be test indicators or other forms of indicators. Ranked data are examined, and then quickly we identify winners. Winners are identified, and then we're told that lessons can be inferred. Either Finland is promoted as a model, Singapore in its time was promoted as a model, or in an FO report we'll get a colored box telling us about a particular success in a particular country that, again, we don't know really whether any of the items identified in those colored boxes are causally related to educational quality. It's a hunch. The lessons are not tested, but the lessons are promoted. So the first part is the data. The inspiration comes from the examination of the ranked indicators, and the speculation is on the lessons. And the speculation occurs in two meanings of the word speculation. It's speculation because it's a hunch, and it's speculation because it's a bet. I contend that it's time to enrich the comparative education research agenda to answer some questions that this particular form of betting generates. Is the relationship between pursuing quality of outcomes indicators and achieving quality? How are quality of outcomes targets established, interpreted, adapted, and enacted across the global regimes into classrooms? Because they have to be interpreted. They have to be turned in actions, in opportunities to learn in schools. We need to develop empirical and theoretical accounts for the fact that educational systems are changing their relationships to many stakeholders, many agencies, and many actors, while simultaneously attempting to adopt and enact the quality of outcomes agenda. And I would contend that comparativists are particularly in a good position to help illuminate this question, because we have the possibility of the type of variance that cross-national work provides that single-nation studies would not provide. we won't be able to isolate factors that may or may not be related to quality unless it's in cross-national work. And that's why I'm a little bit frightened about the homogenization of educational systems. I would feel better about it if we knew that this was going to take us on the route to quality. My fear is that it will reduce the number of educational experiments in play, and it will reduce our ability to learn what might actually work in classrooms. So back to Phil. I think Phil confronted three important questions, and his expertise was primarily, of course, on sub-Saharan Africa. Can human life be improved? Should it be improved? And can education play a pivotal role in this? I would contend that we share with Phil and with each other and with the global advocates of educational quality the conviction that the answer is yes. But there's one additional important question, and that is how? The radical advocates imply that they know how, that educational systems should bet on the quality of outcomes goals they identify and monitor. I appeal for a comparative education research agenda that calls that bet, that tests that faith with empirical and theoretical rigor. Thank you. We're ready to go? What now?
Thank you, Gilbert, for your very, very challenging talk. And what I'd like to do is invite members of the audience to stand up and shout at the top of your lungs your question until those mics show up for us. So please, questions for Gilbert. Stand up and just, belt it out, please.
Thank you very much. You did like that. At the end, you concluded we need more rigorous assessment of what's going on. I lump randomized controlled trials, the gold standard in rigorous, in the same questionable or category that requires further questioning as you're characterizing the advocates. I'm wondering if you see that as well, or how you would problematize that rigorous testing as well. And one of the the whole notion of what works, I think, is very problematic as well. I think the best we can say is what is working, not what works. Because when you take what is working from one setting and put it in another setting, even taking it down to the microcosm of the classroom, what one individual teacher finds that works with her students one day may not work the next day. So even the rigorous testing, if we're keeping all the research findings way up here, that adaptation and putting into practice that you're talking about, ultimately, as I think you say at the very beginning, needs to come back down to the teacher. And perhaps you could talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
We may disagree slightly, but I think there are areas where we do agree. My primary problem with the gold standard of randomized trials is that it's never accomplished, at least in the types of countries where I do most of my work. Even when we had a randomized child in the Tennessee Valley assessment, this supposed random assessment of children to classroom didn't take place. There were so many exceptions that political connections or other things allowed kids to be moved that we never met the gold standard. So we do need good science on what is appropriate type of empirical work in real field settings. So I might not entirely agree but I do agree that we have a problem there. And certainly research that would tell us better how to collect credible, valid, and reliable evidence in the countries facing the most intractable challenges is urgent. So I agree with you on that score. I suspect that the idea of randomized trial still seems useful to me as a measuring stick, but I've never seen a randomized trial in the field. It's like the unicorn.
Thanks. I'm Pauline Rose, the director of the last Education for All Global Monitoring Report and the previous ones as well. So you might expect that I was provoked by your presentation there. And I guess just to be cheeky in response, I could suggest that there was sort of, you presented the hollow advocacy of reports of this kind. I could suggest it was hollow criticism. First of all, that the purpose of the report is not to do international rankings. I think that there will be copies of the report, if you haven't already got one, on the UNESCO Institute for Statistics table. And if you pick up a copy, yes, you'll see that at the back there's the statistical tables, but the actual content of the report is not analysis of rankings. There's a lot of evidence-based analysis, I'm sure, drawing on the research of many of you in this room to actually put forward policies. The latest report on teaching and learning, putting forward proposals for why teachers are so important, what the ways in which governments need to do to support teachers and so on. So I think the purpose of the report is very different to just ranking countries. And I know that hearing Andrea Schleicher of PISA talking many times, he also makes the same comment, that one can see PISA and TIMSS results being used in ways that are actually supporting government policy and programmes, not the way in which the media uses it to rank countries, and he himself is averse to that as being the main purpose. So I'm not very familiar with those coloured ranking boxes that you mentioned.
And you call them ranking boxes. They're not ranking boxes. They're not ranking boxes. They're examples of lessons from particular countries. So obviously we disagree probably in some areas, but I want to point out a couple of items that, of course, are a little bit more developed in the version of the address for publication. The EFA goals are pursued by the countries in the Fast Track initiative. They are intended to accept and monitor their progress on indicators. This is why I characterize these as regimes. It's not that Andrea sits in a dark place at the OECD plotting international indicators, but we have a regime, a number of agencies and actors that promote these as standards. So we have policies in places like Brazil that set out goals for improvement in PISA. We have, I'm aware of at least a dozen countries in Latin America today that are revising the curriculum, and the primary document being used is the PISA testing framework. And no one will convince me that this does not please Andreas and the OECD. So there is at least some room for disagreement. And just one question of clarification, I've not seen a ranking box in the OECD, but the implication of the reports is that there are better numbers and worse numbers. And you need to increase the better numbers. And of course, the boxes I refer to do not have rankings. What they have are lessons learned in some cases. This project here, this project there, and we're told about the various characteristics of the project that make it intriguing, but in many of those boxes there has been no empirical test to suggest that despite the success of the country, that those are the explanatory factors for the success. And it worries me that these are within the structure of reports that carry such hefty policy weight, that imply a level of surety that I don't believe they can back up. Please, en español, hombre.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was really very good. I can't agree with you. Then we switch a little bit, going a little bit north to Chile and Argentina and going to Mexico. Mexico also participated in TIMSS in 1994. But for some reason, the Mexican government didn't want to show the results. It was an embargo in those results for many, many, many years. And so the organization that made it was very angry, and Mexico is out of that. That is one point. The other point was with PISA. And in Mexico, we have a lot of evaluation. We have the census evaluation that is suspended by this year. We have Scarlet, that is something like PISA, but for thousands of students in Mexico and so forth and so on. And the results are very similar. They teach us something that we knew already without many evaluations, that the poor kids learn less, that the Indian population is underachieving, that the telesecundaria program for poor kids in the rural areas, they perform less than the other ones. And we knew that without all testing. The issue is that even though we know now more and we can have good data, or not that good data, but anyway, we have data, policymakers, politicians, powerful people do nothing to change what is going on. So the use of that kind of information, and because for the most part, I think, at least in the case of Mexico, is worthless.
Carlos, I actually was, as was Richard, involved in witnessed the Mexican decision not to publish. At the time, I can tell you that we at the Directorate of TIMS were informed by the Mexican government that the primary reason that the results wouldn't be published was because of the candidacy of Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas and the need to not provide Cárdenas with any elements with which to attack the PRI. But there is something that the printed version will address. We can question the actual commitment to these goals. I mean, it would be naive to assume that there's genuine commitment in all cases to these quality goals. There's the Mexican example, but if you go further south, but still just a little bit north of Chile, for those of you that are familiar with Peru, Peru also participates in PISA. The first time that Peru published its national results for PISA, a national educational crisis was declared. I was invited, as was Felipe Martinez Rizo and Margarita Zorrilla, to the event in which the crisis was identified. And as I was leaving, I asked the Minister of Education, this was a period right before Toledo becomes president, when all of a sudden data was published and people were willing to do things, right after Fujimori had left. And I asked the minister, well, okay, I live in New York and we have floods and other natural disasters, and when we declare a disaster, it means that we are going to make it easier for loans, easier for resources to reach the disaster area. What new resources will you be investing in education given your declaration of this disaster? And not one sol was going to change in the budget for education. But it was a rhetorical stance about. And I think there is posturing, and there is a lack of genuine commitment on many occasions to these policies. Did the US really think it was going to be first in the world in the year 2000? What's the value? I would think that would have put the death blow to goals-driven educational policy right there, but it's in fact was the beginning. It certainly wasn't the end of goals-driven policy. My argument is just that there's a fruitful area for research in this here. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk, Gilbert. I found myself shaking my head in agreement and then shaking my head in disagreement with every other slide, which I think is a measure of an excellent talk, very provocative. I wonder if you could talk with us about what you see as the potential contribution of qualitative researchers to the agenda that you've outlined for the field.
I think that although I don't say so in the talk, it obviously is first a cry for better comparative work from the qualitative researchers, particularly regarding what happens with children's opportunities to learn. Neither PISA or TIMS or any of those, nor will the collection of large-scale indicators necessarily give us good information about the quality of opportunities to learn in the classroom. So I do see an enormously important role, both in itself, qua qualitative research, but in addition, given my other agenda that we need to learn from the losers, I think that a great deal of work needs to go into developing better large-scale instruments to study what children do learn. I'll give you some news. Children in Argentine classrooms learn. Despite what PISA might say, they learn. The problem is that PISA and TIMSS are not well designed to help us discover what they do learn, because they do not learn what their peers learn in the high-achieving countries. So the message for low-achieving countries is particularly useless when year after year they learn that, yeah, we know now that the Argentines don't perform primarily at PISA level 6. Tell us what they are learning. And what is this likely associated with? And there I see, in addition to qualitative work being rich in itself, as being rich to help us develop new quantitative research instruments. I think there's a great deal of complementarity. I have a great deal of interest myself in understanding how qualitative work can be used to increase the quality of quantitative instruments.
Thank you for the talk. You're talking to a compadre. Yo viví mucho tiempo ahí. I've lived 25 years in South America. My work is more on the social side, making community centers. I live now in China. I work at the University of Beijing. I'm curious, your comparison Argentina and Chile. Many of my children are born in Chile, Argentina, Brazil. And it's true, it's a delicate situation which changes year by year. The political side that often results for political reasons aren't let out. Maybe to support somebody getting into office, things like that. But still, I know that the truth will set us free. Those tests are very good to help us improve. So my question is, since you have access to see how many of these countries give access to their people to know the results, is that improving? I work with international relations, so I'm interested to know, is that opening up, especially between Latin American countries and, if you know, globally?
I think that's one of the results of cross-national assessments that I actually celebrate. I believe that the fact that countries cannot control the content of reports from PISA and TIMSS has been a powerful influence on national governments to publish their data with all of the terrible news that they often bring. Certainly it's very rare now in Latin America for states to hide the results. The Argentine government is accused of hiding a great deal of data about the health of the economic system, and yet they can't control the content of the PISA report. They can decide to withdraw, but they can't edit it. They've asked for a curious national sort of parsing of the data. The Argentines were persuaded that no country in the world had gone through an expansion of the secondary education system like Argentina has gone through. So this is an area where comparativists might have been able to illuminate them that one triumph cross-nationally is the expansion of opportunities in secondary education. So they asked for some reanalyses of their PISA data early on to account for those areas in which the educational opportunities in secondary education had most recently expanded, and it didn't help them in explaining the poverty of the results anymore. And I think, however, that the reason why many of my informants in Argentina were so keen on continued participation is because there is profound distrust of the national tests in Argentina. And I've examined the national test. There's a number of psychometric problems with the tests themselves, and design problems, sampling problems. Everyone's persuaded that if they have a national census test that somehow that solves every technical problem, but the problem with the census is that it's really a sample that we don't know enough about. Of course, how do you convince people the United States has not moved from a national census to a sample-based census, no matter how many statisticians give testimony at Congress?
I'll take one more question, so maybe two more. So I have a gentleman here, and then I'll go over to this part.
In the 1930s, the Progressive Ed Association set up an 8-year study. And what they were trying to do was to see whether or how high schools could meet the needs of students. They hired Ralph Pilot to conduct their evaluation surveys. And he made a design of curriculum and a design of testing which has been categorized or is defined as valid testing. That is, what he tried to do was to see whether or not the students had actually learned what the teachers had taught. And that's often distinguished from reliable testing. As I understand the PISA tests, they're reliable in the sense that we're looking to see who knows what, where, and to make sure that everyone knows the same thing. However, Tyler's idea was that we would actually find out whether or not kids were learning things that were in line with the purposes of the school. Well, why would we choose to rank schools or countries or educational systems according to a measure of reliability, which to me seems more key to economic needs, large corporations hiring people, having reliable soldiers and all of that, than to have something which is more tied to a democratic system, which was Tyler's idea. Why the choice for the PISA reliable model rather than a valid model?
I think we'll take Gilbert's question at the same time.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Gilbert. I appreciated and was immediately intrigued by your title. But I was left wanting to understand what you meant by radical advocacy, particularly when you juxtapose that with those advocate groups and actors being a regime, and wondering what would be a radical agenda, particularly when I saw some suggestions that the way that we might continue to analyze and use data perpetuates some of the power of these kinds of testing. So I want some clarification about what you meant by radical advocacy and what a radical agenda would be.
Right, so should I? All right. Just to complement your comments, one thing that I think people often forget is that neither PISA or TIMSS assess learning. They assess achievement. Learning is the difference between what children know in 2 points of time, and neither PISA or TIMSS have a longitudinal design. They are cross-sectional studies that are interannually comparable. They're scaled for comparison across the years, but they're not studies of learning. And that's one of the key reasons why we are unable to infer any causal factors, because they do not have the type of design that permits it. I believe that despite their raising their nose and their professions of hating rankings, is that they've designed tests that lend themselves almost exclusively to rankings. So there's this strange love-hate relationship that they have with rankings is really inexplicable given the design of the test that they have. They don't assess learning. So, and they're no way similar to assessments like Tyler was likely to be involved in creating. Radical. Here, I might have gotten in the problem of trying to use a word with two meanings. Obviously, the deschoolers were radical in one of the classic senses, in the fact that they lay outside the mainstream. In my view, these advocates are radical in the sense that they contend that quality of outcomes targeted policies are the root of educational improvement. So they're radical in the sense that they promote the idea that target-driven policy is the root of improvement. So I'm saying that the regimes are radical in that sense, not that there's there may indeed be a useful radical agenda outside that, but I was using the word radical in this sense of promoting the idea that they lay at the root, and using the word radical as well because I question that they have any evidence to claim that pursuing quality targets is a good, empirically substantiated route to educational quality, or substantiated in any way, not empirically. Thank you. Thank you.
Bravo.
That's right.
All right. So now we're ready for the next step. Go down 2 levels, just 2 floor levels to the lower level, and you will find a warm reception with lots of food, and a group of young men from the Toronto District School Board playing jazz. And I welcome you. Thank you.